So really the first thing, oops, let me go back. The first thing that I want to focus on, just so you understand the process, is how these applications are read, because I think that has a lot to do with how people are admitted. James and I were talking before we went on how many applications these universities are getting these days. Just 5 years ago, Cornell, for example, where I worked, was getting about 50,000 applications. This past year, they're over 70,000. Northeastern is getting over 90,000. That's not just limited to the Ivy League. And so, students are submitting these applications online through, in most cases, through a portal called the Common Application. And now the admissions office is receiving thousands upon thousands of these. And I don't say this number to scare folks. There's still ways to be very successful in this process. But as these admissions offices are receiving tens of thousands of applications, they need to sort them. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that most families have is the assumption that the first sort, if you will, of an application is by someone's academic interest, when in fact, the first cull, if you will, the first organizing principle is actually geographical region. The selective schools in the US are interested in bringing really interesting, exceptional people from all over the country and indeed all over the world. So it'll never be that if you have a student from Los Angeles who is interested in biology, that they're going to be compared head to head with a student who is interested in biology from Connecticut. They're in different regional pools and they're going to be evaluated differently. The regional committees are looking for the exceptional candidates in that pool. Certainly, once you've organized by region, academic interest, even if you're not declaring a major, just your professed area of strength is going to become a factor. But folks do need to know that, if you've got a cousin in one part of the country and you're both applying and you have the same interests, you're not going to be compared head to head. And I think this is important to know because sometimes folks worry, I understand this, will the person reading my application understand that I go to a tough high school and they grade hard here? Yes, they will. And the reason for that is the people that work in these committees, generally speaking, become very familiar with their particular region over several years. I, for example, chaired admissions committees. There was one particular region I chaired for 9 years. It was the West Coast at Cornell. I became very familiar with all of the high schools up and down. And I'll share a quick story about that. When I inherited that region, the gentleman I inherited it from had been doing that region for 20 years. So nearly 30 years, two people were in charge of one region. And he passed on all of his notes to me. And the story that I always like telling is he shared an example of one particular high school in San Diego. And he said, Artie, if you ever get a student from this high school who has an A in the junior year AP English class, I don't care what they're doing in the other classes, you really need to think about admitting them. And I said, well, shouldn't we normally expect an A in a junior year kind of class like that? He said, well, sure. But at this school, I've been reading this school for 20 years. We get 20 applicants a year from this school. It's a very good school in San Diego. We always admit 4 or 5 of them at least because it's a good school. But in that 20 years, I've seen 2 students, maybe 3, who got an A in that junior year English class. He said that teacher is probably hated by the parents because he does not give very many A's. But we recognize that. And so when we see a strong student, you got to think about it. Well, sure enough, about 5 years in, James, I got my first student from that school that got an A in AP English, and we admitted her. And I'm really glad that we did. She wasn't superb in the other areas, but she was very strong in this one area, right? And we recognized that there's a lot of other great kids and they're not getting this great grade. Well, she wanted to study English. She was the editor of her school paper. And lo and behold, at Cornell, she became editor of the Cornell Daily Sun, which is the daily newspaper. And just a couple of years ago, I was pleased to see she won a Pulitzer Prize writing for the LA Times. I think we did the right thing in admitting her. Her key was being the very exceptional student in a really hard class. But I would want to reassure people, we were still admitting other kids from that school that weren't getting that A. And that's where regional admissions is important because schools grade differently and you see trends and patterns within a particular school. Okay, so you got the regional committee. You, in theory, have people that are very familiar with the schools there. And then you start reading. And no one gets admitted on the first read, but there are people that get refused on the first read. There could be a no. The yes and the maybes move on to a second round. When I was chairing my committee, I had other readers that reported to me. We'd come to a group consensus after a meeting or 2 after the first read. Not very many reads. So the scary part here, James, is that It used to be, when there were a lot less applications, that you could count on an application, a committee spending 30, 35 minutes on an application. These days, my estimate is it's probably about 10 to 15 minutes on a successful application. And that's kind of scary to families because you spend months on this process. So there's things that we're going to talk about on the next slide to make sure that you stand out in a way that you don't get that no, and you're getting more time with the committee to hopefully get in. Okay, so then the committees go through their final group and they make their decisions. And this process is the same, whether it's what's called early decision, which is the round where applications are due November 1st, or early action. Some schools do that, or the January 1st regular decision deadline. This process is the same either way. So the takeaway here is where you live matters. It doesn't mean that where you live is a better place to live. It's just that that's the group that you're competing against. So that process has not changed, but there have been some factors in the selective admissions process that have. And the most significant in recent years is due to the pandemic. Many schools, I read today, it's nearly 2,000 now, are no longer requiring standardized tests, meaning the SAT and the ACT. Very few are what's called test blind. Test blind is a system that, for example, the University of California uses, where they will not consider your test score at all. You have no way of reporting it. Test optional means you don't have to submit it. And that's significant because a lot of students in particular say, oh, I don't have to do it anymore. It must not matter. And James and I have talked about this many times. That's not the case. These tests still make a difference. And I talk to students about the test optional area really means this is a test opportunity. A school may no longer be requiring it, but it is an opportunity among other aspects of your application to help differentiate you in this pool. And so just like a high achieving student would do everything they could to get a great grade in a class, just like a high achieving athlete would go do that extra session in the weight room, if a student has ambitions with a selective university, it makes sense to give the testing a try. And indeed, the data shows that submitting test scores still helps. Let me give you an example. The last 2 years, 50% of applicants to the Ivy League schools have submitted test scores. 50% have not. The admitted student body has been about 30% people without test scores. 70%, however, submitted test scores. Now, I'm an optimistic person. I like to look at the world as if the glass has water in it. I like to say the glass is half full, not half empty. So if you had told me 5 years ago that 30% of the students at Ivy League in admitted class did not have test scores, I would have said, wow, that's amazing. And it is. It has completely changed a lot of things. But it's still important to know that a higher percentage are getting in with test scores. So it behooves people to do research and understand what is it that a particular school is looking for. What's their range? And if you're in the 25th to 75th percentile of what a school looks for, you should submit that score. Not doing so, they may wonder what you're hiding. If you're in the top 25th percentile of what they historically admit, that's probably helping you. If you're in the lower 25th percentile, I discourage students from submitting, and that's okay. Again, the stats bear out. There are still students being admitted. People should definitely not give up hope. My larger point is test optional does not mean let's just get to it if we can. It should still be a part of a strategy. Because of test optional, we have seen a huge increase in the number of applications to these top schools because, for good reason, more students have felt like they have a better chance of gaining admission. And they're right, they do have a better chance. 30% of the students are being admitted without test scores. But we have not seen a similar increase in the size of the admission staff. So that, again, that goes back to my point on the previous slide. We're not seeing, lots of time spent on applications just because of the sheer numbers. It's a decreased amount of time. So students really need to invest in the other parts of the application, which I'm going to get to in the next slide, that are the first things that people see, essays and resume, which we'll talk about. Now, another thing that is already upending selective college admissions is the Supreme Court released a very consequential decision last month, strictly limiting the ways that colleges can consider and use a student's race or ethnicity in making a decision. They did not prohibit students from writing about their experiences or their identity, but schools are no longer allowed to collect that and use that as a discrete factor in making a decision, which in their efforts to produce diverse class, not just of diversity of intellectual interest and diversity of geography, but diversity of socioeconomic and racial ethnic backgrounds, colleges were considering this before. So what has that done? Well, it means that things like the essays are going to become a lot more important because colleges still want to know a lot about who the person is, not just how good a tester or how good a student they are.